Paddy. So yesterday you made some predictions about the Eurovision Song Contest. Were you right or wrong?
Well, I think I was broadly right in the sense that I said that the UK would do well with the juries, which it did, and then crashed. I didn't know it was going to get 0 from the public, which so that's the big story for the papers.
Poor girls.
They didn't deserve 0 from the public, but
harsh.
And it all comes amid the sort of Europe reset week, so it's kind of a great timing for the broadcasters.
Why did Austria win? I have to say I was not a fan. Not that it matters, but I thought, gosh, what a lot of noise.
Well, I mean, it was in advance. It was a fan favourite. So I went to several parties in London 2 or 3 months ago when the fans told me it was going to win. So inevitably, you look back and you think people who know the contest inside out thought there was going to be something about that would appeal. I mean, it's a contest that is not going to change anyone's mind. If they went into last night liking it, they would have liked it. If they went into last night hating it, they would have hated it.
That's almost enough of Eurovision.
It is.
Do you know who doesn't watch Eurovision, who never has?
Actually, I do, because you told me yesterday, but it's such a good piece of news.
Sir Elton John.
Amazing.
We'll talk to him. We'll talk to our pal Henry Zeffman too on this Sunday's Newscast.
Hello, it's Paddy in the studio.
It's Laura in the studio.
And it's Henry at home.
So, Henry, what have we learned this morning about Kier Starmer's grand European deal that may emerge tomorrow? Is he on for 0 points or 12 points?
Well, I think there's 2 things we've learned compared to your very good discussion about this on yesterday's newscast. One is Nick Thomas-Symonds turned up and gave you an interview, Laura, and for all that the government is saying that this is going down to the wire, he would not have been in your studio giving an interview if they thought it was not going to be a deal for them to not only sign but tout tomorrow as a big development. The other thing that we learned that I think actually wasn't on a lot of people's radar in terms of the sort of previews of this summit is that something appears to be in the offing about passport queues. And that is, as many newscasters will be well aware, the fact that since Brexit, if you travel to the EU on a British passport, you tend to go into the other queue compared to the EU queue. And that is a source of frustration for some travellers. Some people seem to post on X about it with quite amazing regularity in terms of how many holidays they seem to have. And that is something that Nick Thomas-Symonds seems to suggest might be changing.
Yeah, can we listen to that? I mean, this is really new to me, and I've always thought there is an argument that the Europeans have been punitive to the British about Brexit. We're very cross with you. We're going to poke you, and the queue thing is a really obvious way for people who think that to post a picture of it. So can we listen to him talking to you about that?
Look, I am certainly pushing for people to be able to go through far more quickly. I think we could all agree that not being stuck in queues and having more time to spend, whether it's on holiday or work trips, having more time to do what you want, not being stuck in queues, I'm sure we could all agree that that would be a very sensible
so that was a smile.
objective.
So I'm going to take it from that. You're quite confident you'll get that. Yes, because this morning we were in one of those situations where the minister didn't want to tell us everything that he knew, but he did want to signal things. So I was quite overtly saying, OK, so he did a smile when he was talking about passport queues. He did a smile also when he was talking about getting rid of some of the checks on food and flowers and agricultural products that come in. So to alleviate the situation where you have food sitting in lorries while the lorry is sitting at Dover or wherever else for 6 hours having to go through, while the driver has to go through lots of paperwork. So I think there's definite confidence on that. There's definite confidence on passport queues. I thought there was a bit more prickliness around what the details of any youth mobility scheme might look like. So whereby young Brits and young Europeans can go to each other's countries more easily.
I think there is a recognition in government that the youth mobility scheme could be the most politically sensitive element of whatever it is that we get tomorrow. And that's because obviously one of the most sensitive elements of the UK's membership of the EU in the first place was free movement, and the extent to which the youth mobility scheme does or does not resemble old style free movement, I think will be a big argument tomorrow. I mean, the most obvious way in which it won't resemble free movement is that it will be for the youth. So probably 30s and under. But the other, I think, key questions are, is there a cap or is it uncapped? So how many people could plausibly come to the UK under this. And obviously, UK has formed for underestimating the numbers of people who might come to the UK as part of EU migration schemes. And then the other question is, how long would they be able to come to the UK for? Because the original proposal by the European Commission suggested a period of time that was far longer than the UK government, at least initially at the start of these negotiations, was willing to countenance.
I think it will have to be capped if they go for it. And I thought that Nick Thomas-Symonds was actually really quite prickly on this issue. Not because he was prickly, as in he was being mean, but I'd sort of detected there is actually, there is still quite a lot of trouble on this particular issue behind the scenes in the talks. Because guess what? The EU plays hardball. And I may be overinterpreting that, but that was my kind of sense of actually this might not be done yet. And I don't expect that there'll be full details of that tomorrow. And it might end up being even in the sort of quite vague terms that, yes, there'll be a deal at some point down the road, but we might not get that much more information about it tomorrow. We'll have to see.
I spoke to Lucy Fisher of the Financial Times. She said this is the biggest post-Brexit deal. So,
yes.
So that's a fact for newscasters who are seeking facts. Also, they're great at negotiating, the EU. So said a former trade negotiator to us, Crawford Faulkner. He said they're really good at making you think you want things that actually they want you to give. So they're a great negotiating force. So we spoke to Nigel Farage on Broadcasting House. And there's a sort of logic gap here, which is he's said in the past Brexit hasn't been a great version of Brexit. So therefore you could say we should renegotiate it. So I explored that with him, that gap twixt a perfect Brexit, the current Brexit, and should we renegotiate? And this is what he said.
The people that made the big promises were Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. I said very consistently all the way through, Brexit gives us the freedom to run our own lives, and then it's up to us. But sadly, many of the hopes have not been delivered.
Right. So you promised something yourself, and it hasn't been delivered, but you blame the Tories for that. But you did promise something that hasn't come true.
I promised we'd be self-governing. We are.
OK. But
we are self-governing. We are self-governing.
But hasn't really worked.
I'm afraid.
Do you want to just say it hasn't really worked, just as a starting point?
No, it's worked in the sense that we're out and we're free. The fact is that British governments have frankly made a complete mess of it because I don't think they ever really believed in it.
Look, thank you for that. And it's an interruptive start. I just wondered where the starting point is. So it's a sort of flawed Brexit. Can we agree on that?
It's a Brexit that hasn't matched up to the realistic expectations that many of those 17.4 million voters had.
If Keir Starmer does a new deal, it will be the first since Brexit. What would you do with his deal if you were Prime Minister?
We get rid of it. I mean, he's going to give free movement of people to the under-30s. We know that'll be a one-way street. Way more people will come here than will go in the other direction. And you absolutely cannot have the European Court of Justice having a say over trade matters and technical matters. So those things we would absolutely reverse. So
you are in the odd position of pledging to rip up a deal you haven't seen. But on the other hand, I know it's a matter of principle. I mean, if we take, for example, a question what you would do. On youth mobility, would you be giving anything? I mean, is it wrong for 18 to 30-year-olds to enjoy time in the UK?
Oh, we'll extend that to everybody. Why can't we all travel freely? Why don't we abolish borders completely? I mean, these are the arguments that are being made.
It's interesting to hear that. And I think that interview, but also some of the interviews, particularly with the Conservative Alex Burkhart that we did this morning, you just think, oh, we're right back in that moment where politicians are talking about concepts of sovereignty, freedoms, independence, the European Court of Human Justice, the European courts. But I just wonder the extent to which actually those issues are really going to either wind the public up or delight them. You know, we have, as a country, moved on. If you ask pollsters how often people raise Brexit, it is minuscule compared to other big issues. It's a completely different political landscape. There's still big risks for the government. And Nick Thomas-Symonds was, he was reluctant to be explicit about two things that are quite obvious, actually. To get more goodies from the EU, the UK is going to have to agree to go along with more EU rules that it won't have a direct say over. And it is also going to have to pay into some EU schemes if it wants more access to them. Those are two facts, but a government minister this morning just didn't want to be explicit about the fact that those two things are going to have to be true if they want stuff in return from Brussels.
And Henry, what of the hat-trick for football fan Keir Starmer of a India, UK, US UK, EU UK deal within weeks of each other?
I think you have to say it's impressive. They're all different deals in different ways. You know, the India won a proper comprehensive free trade deal of the sort that the Conservative governments said they wanted to strike after Brexit and wanted to preserve the freedom to strike as part of the Brexit deal. The US deal is obviously a much more limited attempt to mitigate the impact of what the current US president has done, but nevertheless a deal that other countries seeking to mitigate the impact of tariffs have not managed to achieve. And then this EU deal does appear to be a real step forward in terms of the UK's post-Brexit relationship with the EU becoming much warmer. As you heard there, it's a subject of very live political controversy whether it ought to get warmer. But given that is the task that Keir Starmer set himself, he's achieved it within a year of getting into government. He's achieved it while simultaneously doing these other two things. I think just as a matter of statecraft, it's pretty impressive.
We'll see how it comes across tomorrow. I mean, it's interesting the extent to which the UK is going to be trying to make this a sort of big, dazzling event. Prime ministers successively learn that even though they might have great successes, they would see it on the world stage, that doesn't always translate into domestic popularity. So as Henry says, I think, yeah, sure, absolutely. You've got to say that in terms of diplomacy, Keir Starmer has achieved a lot. Whether it's Ukraine or whether it's these trade deals, he has re-established the UK as a leader in Europe in a way that we hadn't seen. Rishi Sunak sort of started. So Starmer can say that, credibly, that he's gone a long way to establish a much bigger UK presence in terms of European diplomacy. No doubt about that. But that doesn't necessarily make a difference at home because voters are hard to please.
9 years since the referendum and 6 prime ministers. And, you know, I'd love to hear from the 18-year-old newscaster listening. I'd really like a view. We were told that younger voters have gone to reform in ways that were not predicted by the boffins and the media classes. So I'm not saying I know what 18-year-olds are going to say, but this is about our relationship going forward. What does an 18-year-old newscaster tell us for next week's edition?
Oh, do tell us. That would be fascinating to know. And obviously 18-year-olds don't all think the same way either.
No, exactly. No, I get that. I've been 18.
Like,
I mean, it was quite a
the
long time.
18-year-old newscaster. Maybe we only have one, in which case there is only one set of views from an 18-year-old newscaster. But 18-year-old newscasters...
Where were you at 18, Laura Coons?
Where was I at 18? I was in Paris.
Oh, my goodness. Can we have photos?
Working in a bar? No.
I was working as a waitress in a cocktail bar. And Henry, where were you? Where was 18-year-old Henry?
Well, I was at school, I guess, at university. Nowhere glamorous like Paris.
So look, do we tell, a long time ago when we were talking about the news, do we tell the newscaster there will be a deal? Everything you got out of him in the mood music,
yes.
What Henry was talking to us about, the placement of a minister.
Yes. We'll say, newscasters, there will be a deal which is largely making the existing deal work in a more extensive way.
Passports?
Keir Starmer will say it's brilliant. You might have a quicker passport queue experience. There'll probably be some tidying up and trading of food and agricultural products will become easier. There'll be some sort of vague words at the very least on a youth mobility pact. There'll be some stuff on energy, I think, too. There'll be a big announcement on defence. So Keir Starmer will say it's brilliant. He'll talk a lot about defence and security, actually. I think that's what the government will be spinning very hard this time tomorrow. And the opposition parties, some of them will moan about the UK taking more EU rules and having to give the EU a bit more money.
I think the other thing to think about, as well as the fact that the Conservatives and Reform are opposed to this deal, which is very interesting and important, is how much salience they give to their opposition to this deal. Is that just their position this weekend, or are they going to put it at the heart of their campaigns? My hunch would be that they don't put it at the heart of their campaigns, and that would reflect what Laura was talking about, which is that Brexit is just a much less salient issue in the electorate than it was.
I think
but given that the UK's relationship with the EU has been so vexing for politicians and for the public for so many decades, perhaps we're being naive and perhaps we shouldn't count out its ability to come right back to the heart of things.
So there's another troublesome issue for the government that has been quite niche, but it's not very niche now. And I actually think this is an issue that the government is going to have more and more and more and more trouble on. So short version, is the government and the House of Lords have been arguing for a few months about whether or not AI companies should be allowed to use content online for free that would traditionally have been subject to copyright laws. So books, images, music, writing, all these things that creatives create that AI companies want to suck up in their giant technological hoovers and use them to develop their computer programs, their large learning models, to use the jargon.
I prefer technological hoovers. I'm working with that.
It's a better metaphor, isn't
I love
it?
the AI future. I've seen all the movies,
Yeah.
The Matrix, Terminator, but I've never really until now understood it. And technological hoover is the way to understand this.
Well, we're in the business of communication, aren't we? And that's what
landed.
it does.
It's
They
landed
want
with
these
me.
big programs to suck up all the information in the world and then spew it out in their own ways.
And also, that makes the artists feel really angry.
It makes them feel really, 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 really angry, partly because they don't like the idea that machines can create things better than humans can, but also this is how artists make a living. Traditionally, they're paid through copyright. That's how you can be a writer or be a singer or be a photographer or any of those things and actually be able to put food on your table. Into this whole wrangling row marches Sir Elton John, legendary singer, proper megastar. And I went to meet him yesterday and he is furious. Absolutely furious. And I've never in any interview before heard anybody describe a government minister as a moron or say that the government are, and I quote, absolute losers. And I fully recommend everybody listening to the whole interview on iPlayer because it really is worth it. He was speaking alongside the playwright James Graham, but here's a clip of what they were talking about.
Well, they'd be committing theft, thievery on the highest scale. And for young people, or for everyone who's creative, the fact that AI could run rampant without, you have to ask for approval and you have to have transparency. It's quite simple. If someone wants to use your song, ask, and then you have to have the transparency at how is it being used. That's fine. But the danger is for young artists, they haven't got the resources to keep checking or fight big tech if there is a lawsuit or anything like that. It's criminal, and I feel incredibly betrayed. The House of Lords did a vote, and it was more than 2-1 in our favour. The government just looked at it as if to say, well, the old people like me can afford it. That's not what we're complaining about. We're complaining about people's legacy, whether they're young songwriters, whether they're young playwrights, journalists, whatever. Some people aren't like me. They don't earn as much as I do, but when they're creative, and it comes from the human soul and not a machine, because a machine isn't capable of writing anything with any soul in it. If you've got to get rid of that, and you're going to rob young people of their legacy and their income, it's a criminal offence, I think. I think the government are just being absolute losers, and I'm very angry about it, as you can tell.
He's very, very angry, not least as he went on to say, look, I back Kier Starmer. I went and I did an event for him at St Paul's Cathedral, and he told me he was on the side of young musicians. I don't believe that anymore. He said he feels betrayed. So he's somebody who was quite happy to be seen as an ally of this government, who's now, frankly, absolutely hopping mad. And look, this is a really interesting dilemma for government about how do you balance protecting traditional industries that exist versus encouraging technological industries. They're desperate for growth, desperate to get AI companies to come here. But I just wonder, Henry, if this might end up being something where the government has misread the likely outcome if they don't change their views.
I think that's definitely possible. I think they probably have been taken aback a bit by the scale of opposition, not necessarily within the House of Lords, as it's proved, but in the sort of broader arts sector. And obviously, as one person in government said to me a few weeks ago, they like us. They didn't like the previous government. So it's a bit unusual for a Labour government to be turned on by these people, whereas a Conservative government having some of these rows would have thought, well, these people hate us anyway. That said, this government keeps saying that its number one mission is to get economic growth. One of the ways in which it thinks it can get economic growth is by this country becoming more hospitable than some other countries. In fact, to tie it together to part one of this podcast, more hospitable than the EU to tech companies. And tech companies these days means AI. And I think the government will be, indeed clearly is, extremely anxious about doing anything which signals to AI that after a bit of an outcry in the UK from some people, it's going to change its regulatory environment. I mean, that is the crux of the dilemma here for the government. And, you know, I think you also hear privately from a few people in government who say, well, yeah, hang on a second. You know, these are arts campaigners, not necessarily specifically Elton John, who also ask for subsidy from government for their theatres, for their concert halls, for the artistic life that flourishes in this country. But you know, the government only has a finite amount of money. They're trying to find ways to get more money for this government. And one of the ways they want to do that is by having more tech businesses in this country. So you know, these are all about, as government is, this is all about trade-offs.
And there's a concurrent story about possibly getting rid of the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, isn't there? We're not reporting that. We're just saying...
it's doing the rounds.
Doing the rounds. I mean, I can't remember Elton John making an intervention like that.
No.
I think it's a big scoop, and I'm really thinking it doesn't end there. That's not the last thing that's going to happen.
I think it won't be. And he said to me, we will fight this all the way. We'd go to court. We'd do other things. He said, I'm feeling like a suffragette, and it's the Derby soon.
Right.
I mean, I think irrespective of the issue, also, if you think of somebody like Sir Elton John, who, let's face it, nearly every single person in the country has heard of. Not every single person in the country has heard of most cabinet ministers.
That's right. Well,
he's saying they are losers.
Yeah.
Like, the language here also is really, really unhelpful.
A few weeks ago, we rang David Attenborough. I think I brought this to a newscast because we found a website that uses an AI version of his voice to read news stories. And he was really upset about it. He said, I've spent my entire life trying to be an observer of the natural world. And we do not hear him talk about news events. And then his computer-generated voice is out there. And Brian Cox, the actor, said he's really worried about his voice being stolen, his image being stolen. And now you've got Elton John. Surely it's quite an easy thing for the government to say, is it not? You're going to have permission off artists? I don't really get it.
Well, this is what it comes down to. So you talked even, and some Labour MPs are very worried about it. I mean, one of them messaged me after Elton John and said, brilliant that Elton's speaking up. I've been trying to fight this in the party for 6 months. What this part of these proposals is about, you know, saying to AI companies and tech firms that you can ignore copyright law. Now, the argument goes to people who are campaigning on this issue is you don't have to ditch copyright laws to encourage AI businesses to come to the UK. There are all sorts of reasons why they might want to come to the UK. You can develop technology and technological business without having to do what looks to those campaigners like bending over backwards. And it's interesting because the UK's copyright laws are also in other parts of the world often seen as a model of that's how to do it. So it's quite, you know, I just wonder, if you think about, this is what the Hollywood writers' strike was about.
Yeah.
And it's not exact replica, but that was a huge moment for one of America's biggest sector. Writers went on strike for months. And you just wonder when you have people like Elton John and Paul McCartney willing to do what they never do, really, which is speak about domestic politics. That's something that the government, you know, might want to listen to rather than just saying, oh, it's all very difficult and AI is really important.
I mean, I asked the question, you know, what's the problem for the government? So let's just hear from Nick Thomas-Symonds responding to Elton John criticism. And this is me law-explaining, because this is from your programme.
We want to remain a world leader in AI. AI is the developing, fast-emerging technology of our age. It is going to make an extraordinary difference to our lives, not least, for example, in medical diagnostics. So what the government is trying to do, just to be clear, Laura, is the government is trying to find a way forward that both is dealing with the very real concerns that are being raised and quite passionately by the culture, but also making sure that we maintain that world-leading position in AI. It's pursuing those two objectives. There's the balance we have to strike.
And it's a tricky balance, but do you think perhaps that the government might have misread the mood? I mean, Sir Elton John had told us that the Technology Secretary, Peter Kyle, who's trying to find that balance, he said he's a moron. I mean, the strength of feeling here is profound and it's back in Parliament tomorrow. Have you misread the mood here?
Well, firstly, I profoundly disagree with Ivor. Peter Kyle is an absolutely excellent Secretary of State who's been doing a really fantastic job.
I mean, no cabinet minister wants to have to say about their friend, they're not a moron. Anyway, let's move swiftly on. It's back in Parliament tomorrow in the Lords, and I don't think they're going to give up. Surely that's it for today.
Certainly. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.